whole
All
book
right.
had
Good.
all the scripts. It was just every other page. I think they forgot, they didn't double side it. I don't know what happened. Looked like a printing error.
Didn't flip around. I'm sure that it sounded like that. So,
Yeah, I was
well,
like,
good.
so thank you.
Yeah, I figured that's what happened. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Contract to Close today. So what we're going to take a look at today is that from the component of where there's an accepted offer on a property. And I'll start with that sort of to make sure we have all the logistics of that straight and what needs to happen. And I'm going to talk about the process all the way through to the close table and then maybe a little bit beyond that in terms of follow-up and what kind of things you can be doing to ensure that you loop those clients in for life. And the reason I like to cover this topic separately is because it is an area where a lot of folks don't actually typically do training on. You know, they talk about getting the buyer, showing them properties, putting it under contract. They talk about listings, you know, putting them under contract, marketing them, getting the open houses. And we tend to lose track of this important piece of once that offer is accepted to the close table. I am a strong believer that the business that is done and how you do things from the contract to the close table really reflects and actually is the best place for you to build your referral business from, because it is really a very high customer service component of the process, okay? There's also a lot of responsibility on both agents, whether you're on the listing or the buy side. There's a lot of responsibility to keep track of things where your clients could be at an increased risk. So there's a lot of importance put on this part of the transaction where sometimes I think folks think that this is sort of like, oh, I have an accepted deal, on to the next one, right? But I do think this is a very important process. The way I'm going to go through this is I'm going to actually go through like we're talking about a real transaction, and then as we look at each of the steps, talk about it from both the buy side, what would the buyer agent be doing on that side of the transaction, what are their responsibilities, and then also look at it from the listing agent side and their responsibilities and what you can be doing on the listing agent side. So again, we'll go through the whole process like we're looking at a transaction and put a timeline to that and put some activities to that. So does that sound like a good plan for today? Perfect. Okay. So let's start off with, yay, we have an accepted offer, right? And we'll start on the buy side. So I'm a buyer's agent and my client has put an offer in and the selling agent has told us that we have an accepted offer. So on the buy side, besides letting my clients know that that's such great news, you know, my key components are I need to make sure I get back the fully executed contract as quickly as possible. Because even though they verbally accepted an offer, we don't have a contract until two things happen. And those two things that need to happen are I need to have a fully executed contract, and the listing agent, typically it's the listing agent in this case, has to have the escrow check or the funds, so that those funds have to have also exchanged hands. Okay, and once we've done that, then we have a fully executed contract and someone couldn't potentially go ahead and accept another offer. So on the buying side, we want to be careful to stay on top of the agent, make sure we get back that fully executed signed contract. We're going to put that into our dot loop, which we've already had started, so that we know we're keeping all the correct documentation in that folder, okay? And your responsibility as the buying agent, if it hasn't happened yet, is to get that check to the listing agent or whoever's going to hold that escrow. Now, there's three parties typically that can potentially hold the escrow. The most common is that the listing brokerage company would hold the escrow, so that your client would make that offer out, that check out to the listing brokerage, and they would hold the escrow. And that's, again, there's a field in the offer where that's agreed to. Another option, if for some reason their company, the listing company, does not hold escrow, there are some listing brokerages that don't do escrow accounts, small brokerages, or for some reason there's a problem getting the check to them and they say, hey, just have your brokerage hold it. We can hold it if we're the buyer broker side as well, because we have an escrow account. So it can be held on the listing side or the buyer side. And the last possible option is an attorney that has an escrow account. Okay, so there are occasions where sometimes the escrow will be held by attorney. But whoever's responsible for getting that escrow check or depositing that escrow check as the buyer's agent, you need to ensure it gets to them. Yes, Stacey.
That check that's like the $1,000 check?
Correct. That would be the offer check at this stage. Yep. Yep. So the 1,000 or whatever's agreed to, made out to whoever's going to be holding the escrow. And it's typically, you know, again, very high percentage, it's typically a personal check. You know, as a buyer's agent, it's not a bad practice to, if you see your clients on a property and you know they're going to make an offer on that property, say to them, look, bring me the check for the $1,000 in case we put an offer in made out to the other brokerage. And then that way, if we go ahead with a deal, I'll have that check to move forward with. I mean, otherwise, especially in this case, you're going to be driving and picking it up, or people have to drop things off. So you have to be a little bit careful. We want to make sure it's timely, that that deposit gets in, and that you know that that deposit got in. Okay?
Question?
Yes.
I have used as a, I guess, an additional sweetener, the suggestion to my buyers sometimes to do, 5 or 10,000 on that. Is that any reason not to do that?
So yes, Barbara, there is a reason to do it in this market, right? Because it looks a little more appealing to the other side. Again, if your client has contingencies, they aren't really putting more money at risk, but they could potentially be, right? So the downside of that is the more money your client puts into the transaction, that way, the more money we call at risk in a deal that could potentially become a problem and not get back. We've had deals recently that were through the contingencies, and, because of situations changing, people change their minds. Well, you know what? You're technically walking away from that money unless people can come to an agreement. So the more money you have on the table at that point, really the more money is at risk. Okay? So you want to make sure that that deposit check gets received. There's a little side note on this. And again, we're in different times right now. So a lot of times we're having to leave checks in mailboxes. There are options to wire funds, like folks can wire funds into our company. We do have wire instructions. So if people ask about that, that is an option for these deposits into escrow. But sometimes when you're dropping a check off and we're I'll call it post-COVID, and you're going to the office and you're going to drop that check off, have the admin make a copy of the check and have them sign a receipt for it, that they actually received the check, and then throw that in your file. And here's the reason why I say that is because if there's ever a problem down the line, and let's say you're dealing, we've had this actually happen, where a check got dropped off to Coldwell Banker, but it got lost by the agent. If you have a receipt that that check was actually delivered, that becomes that agent's responsibility. And if God forbid it's not a personal check, it's a bank check that's hard to replace, that becomes even more important in those types of transitions or handoffs. So make sure you're sort of documenting and staying on top of it. It's your job to make sure that that happens as soon as possible. Let me just give you a little bit of the downside of what can happen, because a lot of folks will say, oh, it's okay, I'll get you the offer tomorrow, or I'll get you the check tomorrow, or I'll mail the check, it'll get there in 4 days. There's a couple of downsides potentially, so we want this to happen as quickly as possible. And here's the reason, and we've seen this in the past. Your sellers agree to, you've got a buyer, the sellers agree to accept the offer, the agent calls you back and said, great, we've accepted the offer. The sellers are traveling at the moment, but they'll get it back as soon as they can. We'll have the offer back to you tomorrow. You're working to get them the check. Next thing you get a phone call saying, we're so sorry, the sellers have accepted a different offer. Somebody came on the table much higher. They technically at that stage, really, it's not a right thing to do, but they can do it. And if there's enough money on the table, trust me, they will do it. So be careful, until you have that executed offer back in your hands and the money's in their hands, you do not have that fully executed contract. So keep that in mind. And as a buyer's agent, especially, that really falls on our side to make sure we solidify that deal and we don't open that door for our buyers to maybe lose something that they worked hard to win. On the seller's agent side, again, there's a making sure that that executed contract again gets sent to the buyer's agent, right? You submit the loop to us if it is on the sell side now, it's been fully executed. And then you want to make sure you follow up and that deposit check is received. So now here's a piece where we see a lot of listing agents fall down. This is sort of your responsibility to make sure this check falls in. Now the admins are very good about reaching out and usually saying, hey, we got this check for there, we're depositing it now. But if you don't hear that, like within a day and you've expected that check to go in, you need to follow up. And like with COVID right now, we're asking for any checks that get delivered to any of the offices or wherever they're going, whether they're being wired, whether they're being made to corporate, whether they're being sent into the office, that you let the admin know so that they can keep track of it. And they can make sure that that actually executes and comes through. And then they're letting the agent know when that's happened so that on your side, if you don't hear something within a day or so, hey, wait, what happened to that check? Have we ever received that check? And we need to follow up. Problem with getting to a closing table and that money was never received, right? And you don't want to find out then that somewhere along the line we lost that original transaction or those original funds. Chip has made a comment about, you should keep a copy of your checks on both sides. You do black out the routing and account number, because a lot of times the financing will ask for a copy of those checks from you for proof of the deposits that went into the transaction. So better to put them right in your loop with, again, just put piece of paper, black out the account and routing information. So it's for security purposes. Anytime you're sending a copy of that check, even if you're sending it with an offer to show the proof of funds or show that you have the check in hand, that stuff should always be blocked out for security. You should be never sending that full check. Okay? So that's our executed contract piece. You're going to submit the loop, because that in Commonwealth, what that does is that actually opens up the transaction for us. So the admins look for those new transactions at that point where you have an accepted offer, and they're putting it into our tracking system. It's called Broker Wolf. You guys don't need to know that piece of it, but that's where we track all of our transactions, and that's where the admins stay on top of your deals as well. And so that they know when to get you like your commission invoice and when to get ready for the closing based on the information that you've put in that offer. Now, my next recommendation, once we have that accepted offer in that loop, there's a little bit of a timing issue, because we're going to talk about the contingency piece, but I always like to loop the attorneys in right away. So, there's some folks that will say, well, we're going to get through the home inspection first, and then we're going to loop the attorneys in. But honestly, I've always looped the attorneys in from the get-go, find out who the selling agent is. If I'm on the buy side, I've, asked the client who do they want to use. If they've wanted a recommendation, given them that. And then I've done an email where I pull everybody together. Here's the listing agent, here's the buyer's agent, here's the listing attorney, here's the buyer's attorney, here's the accepted contract. The inspection scheduled for this date. We'll follow up once the inspection's complete to get ready for the P&S. And part of the reason I do that is so that the attorney can get things ready, right? They're not trying to do things, a lot of times between the actual inspection being finished and the P&S signing date, there's not a lot of time in there. And the attorneys, especially right now, are very busy. So this lets them queue up a base purchase and sale, get some stuff lined up, do some research on the property, and then all you have to do is let them know, hey, there was a couple of changes to the deal because of the inspection, or we're good to go, where everything's all set and we're going to move forward, and they can go forward with the purchase and sale. Okay? So looping the attorneys in, or starting to make sure that we know who we're using for attorneys. Again, make sure, we have definite recommendations within the offices, but the key, if your client says they have an attorney they want to use, is just verify with them that that is in fact a real estate attorney. You don't want cousin Joe that's a divorce attorney doing a real estate deal in Massachusetts. It's really not a pretty situation when that happens. Because it's anybody who's done a transaction knows that the attorneys put huge addendums. There's all kinds of other components that come into play. You want somebody that really understands the magnitude of a transaction in Massachusetts and just doesn't look at that as just a standard purchase and sale contract, because there's really no such thing anymore. There's just so many possibilities of things that can go wrong. Okay? So that takes us to the first contingency. Typically in an offer, you may or may not have a contingency for an inspection, but the inspection is typically what will happen next. On the buy side, it's your job to make sure your clients book an inspection. You can give them a couple of company recommendations if they ask for that. And you want to make sure that you're keeping close eye on the dates. Now I'm going to back up just 1 minute, because from both the sell side and the buy side, the biggest job you have in this transaction is to watch the dates. And you need to watch those contingency dates closely. I would strongly recommend, whether you're putting them into a CRM and tracking through some kind of task management, which you can actually do through .loop, whether you just put them in your calendar, but have some system for how you follow up and keep track of your dates. Don't try to do that by memory, because as you start to get into more and more transactions, that becomes really critical. Because if you miss a contingency, especially on the buy side, but really on both sides, that can cost your client a lot of money in the end and be a big problem. And that is the biggest part of your job. So go back to the inspection, you're going to make sure they book it in a timely fashion based on the contingency that you have. Again, a typical contingency is 7 to 10 days from that accepted offer to get it done, but you're going to want to try to book it on the early side of that. You don't want to try to book the inspection on the last day, because you've got to evaluate the results, and depending on what kind of testing you've done, depending on the results, you may want to bring more experts in. You may need to wait for radon results. So there's some timing issues here that you need to make sure you balance. So you should have your buyers book a home inspection as quickly as possible. And right now the inspectors, well, and always actually, inspectors are used to sort of that week timeline on offers. So that's how their schedules fill up. So it's not typically difficult to find inspectors that will do an inspection within a couple of days for you, because that's really how they're operating as well. Okay, so you're going to book that inspection. You're going to make sure you have a conversation with your client about what types of things they might be inspecting for. Now, you have, a home inspection, which would be a typical home inspection. You have potentially a radon inspection. In Massachusetts, radon is fairly prominent in most of our communities, and a radon test can be administered one of two ways. They can put a system in the house and take what they call an instant read, so they read it over 24 hours and get actual numbers. Or you can leave a canister in the house for 48 hours and then pick it up and send it to the lab for analysis. And so this is where we get into having to make sure we have some timing down pat, right? Because there's some timing to that if we're gonna leave a radon can behind and then get it to the lab. If we can't get an inspector for like 5 or 6 days, but we know our clients really want a radon test done, then talk to the inspector about maybe dropping off the radon can 2 days before and picking up the radon can at the actual inspection, as opposed to dropping it at the inspection and picking it up after. Okay? So radon testing is one. Pest inspections. If the house has a well, there might be water quality testing. And then if you get into a well, there might also be radon in the water testing, which, by the way, mitigation for water is fairly expensive. So that's something you typically, if you're doing well testing, you'd want to advise your clients to make sure they have that radon in the water tested, right? They might be doing a pest inspection, and then they might want to bring in extra experts because of a certain circumstance that they saw. Maybe they were extra concerned about the foundation, and so they're going to bring in a structural engineer as part of this to make sure the foundation's sound. Because keep in mind, your inspector is more from the general, right? They're going to look at all the elements of the house structurally, component-wise, and sort of give you an opinion on that. But many times, if there's a big problem, like they might say, okay, well, the electrical looks like it could, it might have some double wires and stuff. You may want to bring an electrician in to have an official report. Because again, the home inspector is approaching that from more of the bigger picture, right? They're not an electrician typically. Okay, and so having that extra time allows you to do that. So once the buyer schedules the home inspection, as the buyer's agent, it's your responsibility to make sure you let the listing agent know right away when that inspection is going to be and arrange access for the house. Let that listing agent know that, we're going to be leaving a radon can, or maybe if you're going to be leaving it early so they understand that. I'm shocked at how many agents miss this step. I've been a listing agent a lot of times, and people have called me and said, the inspector's at the house and we had no idea they were coming because the buyer's agent never let us know when they were coming. So make sure that's communicated to the listing agent. Even if the house is vacant and you know you're not putting people out, you need to communicate that to the listing agent so that they can arrange. You should never be going in the house without that listing agent knowing that you're going in that house from a liability standpoint. Okay, even if sometimes when there's a lockbox, they get lazy and they don't think about it. They think, oh, it's not a big deal. I know how to get in. Make sure you're keeping that listing agent in the loop. And again, watch your timing. Make sure you're going to have enough time to get everything in and all the reports in. So on the listing agent side, you're going to want to know when the inspection is. Then there's a couple of schools of thought about whether the listing agent goes to the home inspection or not. So I'm going to talk about both scenarios, sort of the pros and cons, so that you can understand sort of where people come from. The first is sort of that liability issue of whether you should be in the house to keep an look out for your seller's best interest, to make sure things aren't damaged or, pulled apart or everything's put back the way it needs to be when they close up. The home inspector is going to climb up in the attic. They're going to be in the basement. They're going to be pulling panels open and stuff. And so sometimes making sure that things are secured up again. Your home inspectors are very professional 90% of the time, 99% of the time. It's that 1% of the time we just want to make sure things don't get damaged in the process. The negative side to a listing agent being there is if what we know we must disclose. So if you hear things from this home inspector, whether they're right or wrong, and I'm going to put that caveat in there because not all home inspectors are fabulous at their job. Again, a majority of them are, but every once in a while, you'll get different quality. We've had inspectors come in and say, oh, there's mold in the attic. And you bring a mold inspector in and they're like, no, that's not mold. That's just old dried stuff from before the roof was replaced. Now the roof is replaced, but it's not actually mold. So they go based typically on visual and quick assessment, whereas sometimes when you have a full analysis, that's not really the scenario, right? So from the selling side, if you're there and you hear things, it really is your obligation to disclose that. If these people walk away and now you list the house and again, and now we're remarketing it, okay? So there is a little bit of a balance there. The other side of that too is understanding the importance of things. So as a listing agent, I like to, and still will go, but I will hang in the kitchen. I won't follow the inspector around. And I will listen from a standpoint, I want to hear what the inspector is really concerned about, because when those buyers come back with something, I want to understand really the magnitude of what that inspector was saying. Because a lot of times, again, the inspector might have said, I'll give you an example. The inspector might say, well, you know, the furnace looks like it's end of life, but it looks like it's in great shape and it looks like it's been well cared for, so you probably have another couple of years. And the buyer agent comes back after the inspection and says, oh, the furnace is at end of life. The buyers are concerned, right? You don't get that additional leverage of, well, we know it's an older furnace, but it's in really good shape, okay? So, you know, again, weigh that, talk to your individual managers about the thoughts and the legality of that. But again, you know, you don't want to be in the middle of the inspection. You do want to make sure there is an agent present with the inspector from a licensing standpoint. You don't want an inspector in the house by themselves. So if for some reason the buyer's agent isn't going to be there for whatever reason, although they should be, and they should be the one listening and paying attention, you know, then you would want to make sure, again, the house is secure and things are looked after. Okay. Also, as a listing agent, it's a great opportunity to offer extra insight. So the listing agent, the inspector might ask, well, does anybody know how old the roof is? And you can say, yes, we know it's 5 years old and it has a 50-year warranty on it. And so you can give them information that can hopefully help them with their inspection and also curtail extra question marks that leave the buyers wondering if they're really okay with everything. You know, inspector's going to go on the side of caution. They're not typically going to alarm the buyer, but sometimes that can alarm the buyer if they don't have the right facts. Okay. The radon testing is, Chip was just asking about the radon testing. The leave-in house unit is usually left for 24 hours, and that's an immediate read, is my understanding still. I don't think that's changed. And then the canisters are usually left for 48 hours and then picked up and sent to the lab for analysis. And it's not a, you know, they both work well. In Massachusetts, the acceptable level is 4.0 and under, and then above the recommendation is radon mitigation. And again, it's a recommendation. It's not like, you know, people have to do that as part of the deal. Be careful with our contingency addendums on the Greater Boston Form. The inspection and the radon are separate. So if you intend to test for radon and go back asking for mitigation, that really should be a separate contingency. That really should be identified in that radon contingency component. On the Massachusetts Association of Realtor form, that's really all covered in one block, so it's not any different. Okay? Questions on the inspection piece? So as the buyer's agent, once you come out of that inspection, it's your responsibility to talk to those buyers about, okay, now that we've been through the inspection and we have all the results, are there any concerns, any questions that you may have? Sometimes there's just questions out of that we want the seller to answer, so you're going to communicate that. But the key here as the buyer's agent is to watch that contingency date. What's the date that we have the contingency for the home inspection until, so that we make sure we stay on top of that date. And if we're running up against it, we're still waiting for answers, or we're waiting for test results, or, you know, we're just concerned, well, then do an extension form. Extend that contingency so that you have time to keep negotiating and you don't put your client's money at risk. Okay? Once they, someone's asking about who's paying for radon testing. That's all the inspections are typically paid for by the buyer. All the inspections are typically paid for by the buyer most of the time.
Do the homeowners go to the inspection also sometimes?
No.
No.
No, that's a pretty strong no.
I got that.
Because they're going to have a lot of opinion and injections. And again, the inspector's looking for problems in the house, so that can really set some sellers off. You know, it's helpful to know like I'll say, if I've had a seller who says, no, I really want to be here, I'll say, look, it's really better to let the inspector do their job. Under COVID, that's easy because the inspectors are sort of limiting how many people they want there, right? So it's kind of easy to get those sellers out of the way for their safety. But, you know, I always tell the sellers, I'm there to represent you and I will be the eyes and ears, and then we'll communicate from there. If there's anything that really does need to take place as a follow-up and or there's some questions, then we'll loop back and get those answered. But the sellers typically can't keep their mouth shut. And so that can be really dangerous. That could be really dangerous. Okay? Too many cooks in the kitchen, as we say. Keep it simple. Okay, so we get through the inspection. We may have some items to renegotiate. I mean, you don't approach the inspection as a place for renegotiation, but there's some possibilities of some surprises out of the inspection. So we may go back and ask for radon mitigation system or a credit for something or a furnace to be cleaned, or, you know, I've had some folks ask for pest treatment because it was mouse activity. So they can ask for things out of the inspection potentially, and there could potentially be a renegotiation. But keep in mind, in today's very competitive market, the seller isn't obligated to do any of that. They don't have to agree to do anything, okay? They might agree to, and especially if it's within reason, and it makes sense because it's something big. You know, again, keep in mind that contingency addendum is really focused on structural, mechanical, safety issues. It's not looking for little piddly stuff. The other stuff that the home inspector uncovers is really just to give your buyers sort of what I always tell them is their working honey-do list for when they move in the house, that they'll always have a honey-do list of things that need to be taken care of, because there's not, you know, they're not typically brand new houses. And so that's not really, it's not the seller's job to make every little component perfect. Okay. Once we come to agreement on that, and that can be verbally or through, I would recommend through email at least. It doesn't have to be on official forms, but I would recommend that you get something through email that everybody's agreed to that. Then that needs to be relayed to the attorney so that that can be added into the purchase and sales agreement. And so that next important date and execution is the purchase and sales execution. The attorneys will go back and forth and get a good contract, okay? That we do not draft purchase and sales. We let the attorneys draft them, just to be clear about that. Yes, there's a standard form in there, but and there always should be an attorney. Highly, highly recommended. Personally, I won't work with a client that won't pull an attorney into the deal because they've increased my liability and risk way too high for me. There are way too many things that attorney brings into the deal. And when you're talking about a $500,000, $700,000 house, and you're talking about maybe $1,000 in realtor fee and attorney fees, that is pretty low investment to maintain the integrity of the transaction and to ensure minimizing their risk, okay, and protecting their money. So there always should be an attorney involved in Massachusetts. And so those attorneys are going to go back and forth. Again, your job to stay on top of that purchase and sale execution date. The attorneys typically, a good attorney will do that as well. And they may even grant extensions just attorney to attorney, which is a possibility. Through email, you might see the attorneys say, hey, we're getting close on this, but we're waiting to hear on one more thing. You know, will you grant an extension for one more day? And the attorneys can do that just attorney to attorney if needed. But you should stay on top of that as an agent in case the attorney is not on top of that. Once the final purchase and sale is completed, that should come from the attorneys, typically on your side of the transaction. So the buyer's attorney should send the buyer the final version of the purchase and sale, if you will, and the seller's attorney should send the listing agent what they believe to be the final version of the purchase and sale. Okay? Buyer's agent, you're going to take that purchase and sale that comes from that buyer's attorney. You're going to do a quick scan for a couple of the highlights that you know of. Again, you're not a lawyer, but you want to verify the parties. You want to verify the address. You want to verify the dollar amount that everybody's agreed to. You want to verify the closing date. You want to check the broker paragraph, make sure it references the correct brokers and it references the correct broker fee if it's put in there. Okay. And then what you're going to do is load that into .loop so that your clients can I have them initial every page and sign where they need to sign. There's typically a purchase and sale with a lot of addendums. Okay. So you're going to have them sign a copy of that, and it can be done electronically. And you need to make sure that you have arrangements or know how you're going to get the purchase and sale deposit check from that buyer, because you'll need that in your hands as quickly as possible based on that date as well. Okay, once they sign that, you have the check, you're going to forward that over to the listing agent. And then let the listing agent know, like maybe if you've sent it an email, I usually send them a check, hey, the P&S is in your mailbox, please let me know once you have a fully executed P&S so that you can stay on top of it. Buyer signs first. Buyer signs first, hands over funds, then sellers sign the purchase and sale agreement. Okay, and they're all signing on one document. As the listing agent, what do? Well, I'm going to take that contract that comes over from the buyer's agent. I'm going to do a quick cross-check to what the listing attorney has told me we should be signing to make sure we're actually signing the right document. I know that sounds like a little thing, but it can be important. Want to make sure we're signing the right version of the document. And I also, as a listing agent, want to check some of those components. Are the parties correct, the address, the amount, the broker's indicated right, and especially as a listing agent, I want to make sure that that brokerage fee is correct. Now, Lily had asked if you get to the purchase and sale and find out that the client doesn't want an attorney, as an agent, have you exited out of the transaction? 99% of the time, Lily, I've had this conversation with the buyers before we've gone into the transaction. That these are the steps, we're going to do an offer, you're going to hire an attorney, so that if there is a problem, I know that before we even get into the offer stage with them. And I can have that conversation and explain to them why it's so highly recommended. And give them some examples of all the possibilities of where their money could get tied up and there could be a problem if they're not properly represented. Okay? On the sell side, I'm going to execute that purchase and sale with my sellers. I'm going to make sure that I get those funds so that they get deposited into escrow. Again, as a listing agent, that's your responsibility to follow that check and make sure it gets in. You might not be handling it, but make sure it gets deposited into escrow. More importantly, on the purchase and sale, because we might be closer to a close at this point, and you want to make sure that those funds are clearing. Okay, please make a note from really both the buy and the list side, but specifically from the list side. If you are executing a purchase and sale and getting a check, and you have a fairly quick close from there, sometimes there's no more contingencies because it's a cash deal. So if you're closing within 10 business days from that time when you get that purchase and sale check, that has to be a bank check. That has to be a bank check. We can't take a personal check. Because what will happen is we'll get to the transaction and that check will not have cleared and we'll have a problem. Okay, so anything closing within 10 business days or earlier from that purchase and sale, you need to get a bank check. If you're on the buy side, watch the language in the purchase and sale. Some brokerages require a bank check on the purchase and sale, regardless of the timing. You see a little less of that now, but there are some brokerages out there that will require that. Okay, if you are getting a bank check from your clients, please handle that with the utmost of caution. Those are not replaceable. And that's sort of the danger of them. Like, you can't just cancel the check and reissue it. They can be very complicated to have that happen. So make a copy of it. Make sure you hand it off to the agent. Make sure you get a signature that you handed it off to the agent, so that if there is a problem, you have that record and the liability will shift to that other side. I only stress that because we've had that happen in the office more than once. And with a very large bank check, like $30,000, $40,000, because those purchase and sale checks can be very big, right? So we need to know that those were handed off properly, and then it becomes their responsibility to get those deposited. So we're watching our dates. We're getting the purchase and sale executed in a timely fashion. Once that's in the loop, whether you're on the listing or the buy side, you're going to submit that loop again for review. Now that the purchase and sale is done, you're going to submit that loop for review. Now, a couple things just to keep in mind, or to make sure you have in that file sort of ready from a compliance standpoint. Make sure you've got all your mandatory agency disclosure forms. Make sure you have your offer and you have your executed offers. Make sure you have the purchase and sale. And if the house is prior to 1978, then you need your executed lead paint at this point if it hasn't already been done. So make sure that the seller has done a lead paint and that the buyer has signed that actual lead paint form. If your sellers did a seller's disclosure, then make sure you have the buyer's signature on that seller's disclosure as well. Again, please there's no use in a buyer signing a blank lead form. the buyer's always signing to what the seller has attested on that form. And so they always sign the seller executed lead form. If it's not in MLS or you haven't gotten it and you're on the buy side, request it from the listing agent so that that can be taken care of ahead of time and it won't hold up you being paid out at the end of the transaction as well. Okay, so we good up through the purchase and sale? Any questions up to that point? Yeah, there is a consent to electronic forms in there, Andy. Most of the attorneys have said that based on the laws that the electronic signatures, because they're through .loop and certifiable, that we don't technically need the consent, but we get it as another level. Okay, just to add in there.
I actually had a question regarding that specifically.
Go ahead.
I had a client ask that if they needed to sign the electronic consent in person and able to sign the rest of the forms via .loop.
Not really, no.
In
fact, and they really can sign the forms in .loop. The attorneys recognize that as a legal signature because it is date and time stamped and authenticated, and it closes the document. So if you've ever gone into .loop and you have an executed form and then you try to make a change to that form, it always clears the signatures. And because of that security on there, that's why they accept those signatures. Because
Okay.
a form can't be changed post-signature. It's actually more secure than a handwritten copy.
That's pretty much what I said.
Yeah, because a handwritten
I
copy,
was just,
somebody could change a term on after, yeah.
yeah, I was just kind of, the logic, the rationale behind it made sense, even though it's, in my opinion, a little ridiculous that, like, hey, you need a
Yeah, it's just
electronic consent form to,
It's another form, but yeah, it's not a requirement from our standpoint that you have that signed, and the attorneys don't typically need to have that. It is part of the loop, and it's not a problem with having them sign that. It's sort of another layer of protection. Okay, so we get the purchase and sale executed. We've uploaded it. We've sent that off to the admins for review so that they know that we're in that process, and actually they take that purchase and sale and upload it into the transaction. And again, they're keeping track of this. They're keeping track of this as they go through the process to make sure that they stay on top of your date. So if anything's changed out of that deal, like maybe the amount changed or the timing changed, when you submit for review, you have the option to put in a little note on there. And so it's kind of nice. They're typically looking at it, but it's nice to put in for the admins, please note purchase price has now changed from 800,000 to 795,000, or please note closing date is no longer 5/31, but now 6/15, so that they can actually update the system and update their worksheet that they're working from to make sure that they keep everything in line. Chip is mentioning that they have virtual notaries, actually under, that is not for everything. That's actually for certain circumstances, and it's really identified for closings. And I guess from my understanding and talking to some of the closing attorneys, it's actually extremely difficult because it has some very tight controls put in place. So that's not for all notary transactions, it's for closings. And it's a pretty tight process from what we understand. I don't have all the details. So the next piece, we've got the purchase and sale submitted. Do we sit back and just wait for the closing to show up? We do not. If we're on the buy side, there's a couple of things we need to now keep track of, because the next piece for us is the mortgage contingency, okay? And what will have to happen typically between that purchase and sale and that mortgage commitment is an appraiser will need to go out to the property to appraise the property. The challenge from the buy side is you don't get the phone call from the appraisal. They usually contact the listing agent, so you don't typically know that the appraiser's actually gone in. So I usually like to keep track, on the buy side, if I haven't heard from the listing agent or an appraiser or the bank within a week, then I might reach out to the listing agent and say, I'm just following up. I want to make sure you've heard from the appraiser and they've gotten access. Or I might reach out to the mortgage broker and say, I'm just following up. Make sure you've got the copy of the fully executed purchase and sale, which they typically will need as well. Ask them if they need anything else, and ask them if the appraisal has in fact been ordered and if they've gone out to the property yet. In this timing in COVID, you may start with the mortgage broker, because there's a lot of instances where there's what they call desktop appraisals, which means they're using just the information in MLS to complete the appraisal, or they're just doing an exterior drive-by. There's also a lot of appraisal waiving going on. I just closed, in the process of closing a listing for a friend, and I never heard from anybody, and so I reached out to the buyer's agent, they reached out to the broker, and we found out that the appraisal was actually waived for this transaction. So if there's enough money being put down right now, they're actually just waiving them because they don't want to take the risk of going in the house. Okay, but it's your job to stay on top of that. It's your job to follow up and know that, okay, I don't want to wait till the mortgage commitment date and find out an appraiser never went in the property. Because now we're not only a day or two away, we're a few days, maybe 4 or 5 days away from having an answer, because by the time the appraiser gets out, submits the report for review, the report goes to underwriting, you're talking about a fairly lengthy process there. So within that first week after the purchase and sale, you want to be following up to make sure that that appraisal's actually happened. Okay, you also want to keep track of the mortgage contingency. So again, if you're talking to that mortgage broker, you might want to ask them, okay, have my buyers gotten everything you need into them? You know, if there's an issue with the buyers being slack about getting paperwork in or not doing what they need to do, it's good if that mortgage broker tells you so that you can follow up with your clients and say, look, we don't want to jeopardize your money on the table and we don't want to jeopardize your dates. You know, when I talked to your mortgage broker today, just to follow up, he was mentioning that he's waiting for your updated tax returns. You know, can you make sure that you make that a priority to get over to them? So be the ally with that mortgage broker to make sure that your buyer gets all the paperwork in that they need to do. Okay, and again, your mortgage broker will be communicating directly with them, but sometimes it's nice to give that buyer that extra push. We usually know the buyers that aren't good at that stuff, the ones that, you know, aren't very detail oriented. And so those are the ones for sure you stay on top of, but you just, you know, earn your keep. Make sure you're following up. Make sure they know you have their back, that you're watching the dates. And a good real estate attorney will also be watching those dates. So that's kind of a nice double-tiered effect, okay? So the mortgage contingency, if I'm on the buy side, I'm watching that date very closely because that's my client's money on the line. I'm reaching out. If I have not gotten a notification of a commitment from the mortgage broker, like the day before or 2 days before, I'm going to reach out to that mortgage broker and say, hey, I'm following up on the transaction we're doing at 100 Main Street. I know the mortgage commitment's in 2 days. Where are we at with that? Are we on track? Do we have the commitment letter? Okay. The other thing to watch, and again, this is just, again, looking out for your client's best interest, is the commitment letter. You know, when you get a copy of that, check the conditions on they may get a conditional commitment, which means they get a commitment, but this and this have to happen in order for them to get the house. Be careful that there's things in there that your client can in fact take care of, and be careful that there's things in there that you may not just need an extension on the commitment for. Like if it's really something that you're concerned that you may or may not be able to get, then you definitely want a commitment, you want an extension to the contingency addendum to make sure you cover that condition. Even though you have a commitment with those conditions, we want to make sure everything's covered. Okay? Again, going back to COVID deals, a lot of the COVID deals, those mortgage contingencies are fairly close up to the closing date. They always need to be not always, because in COVID we're seeing them right up to the date because of employment verifications, but typically there's a 3-day right of rescission on deals. So your mortgage company is going to want to have everything lined up and the buyers to sign some paperwork 3 days before the closing so that the 3-day right of rescission is expired by the time we get to the closing table. So they'll have actually started to sign their package with the mortgage company ahead of time. What you don't want to do is have a commitment that's too far ahead of the closing. So let's say you have a closing date that's out a couple of months. That commitment date should be within a week or two from that closing date. Don't have that commitment date be like a month or two ahead of the closing, because things, again, can change. And the mortgage broker is going to need more information. They're not going to be able to commit to something that far out because there's going to be things that need to be verified and processed right before the closing. Okay? So keep that in mind when you're writing your offers. On the seller side, so you work for the seller. I'm going to ask a question. Let's see if anybody's brave enough to answer this one. When you're on the sell side, should you be reaching out to the broker and or the buyer's agent to get the commitment letter based on that expiration date? I see heads nod. I see Barbara nodding no. Okay. Anybody else have a thought? Okay, so the answer is no. And here's why. You look out for the seller's best interest. If the buyer lets that date slip, what happens? Right? You have you have you now have that contingency money basically goes to your seller because they let dates potentially let dates slip. So really, if you're looking out for your buyer's best interest, you're not typically following up on that date. You're watching the calendar to know that that date's passed and now we're at a further, we're further along in the transaction. But that's not typically something I'm reaching out to get. They may call me and tell me they have it now, and that's fine, but I'm not the one that's doing their job for them.
So Paula, if we don't hear from the buyer agent on that date, is it okay to, follow up a couple days later and just sort of say, hey, just checking in, assuming all is well with the mortgage, just sort of, it's obviously past the date. Is there any reason to do that?
Again, at that point, really, that you don't care. You're past the date, you're moving on, right? So it really, yeah. Typically, typically you go forward as if you're getting to the close table at that point, okay? And it's why, as a buyer's agent, it's so important you watch those dates. That really is your responsibility, and that's why the attorneys will typically watch it closely. But again, on the buy agent side, I really think the weight is on your shoulders there. The buck stops with you. You're the one that wrote that contract. You set up those dates. You need to track those dates with them. It's your responsibility. You can't be brushing that off to anybody else in that transaction. Okay? Mm-hmm. So once we get the contingency, now we're just sort of prepping for close, right? Couple of things that need to be happening somewhere along the line in here. More so from the sell side. So let's go to the sell side. If the property has a private sewage, making sure we have the Title V available sooner than later. And you can't, it needs to be available for closing, but the bank's usually looking for that ahead of time. So making sure you get that full original Title V from the sellers or from the town. If it's a condo, making sure that the 6D's been done, right? You're gonna need that 6D certificate to get to the closing table. And that's just a document asserting that the seller has paid all their fees and there's no outstanding obligations on the condo at that point. Make sure you're filling any conditions. On the sell side, if they've asked for work to be done, typically you'll provide receipts showing that that work's been done. So the earlier you do that and sort of get that all out of the way with the attorneys, the better. And that should be forwarded to both attorneys and the other broker so that they know these conditions have already been taken care of. This isn't something we have to worry about on the final hour. Okay. On the buy side, again, just talking to your buyers, make sure that they're prepping to have the money available. Sometimes, it typically doesn't fall on our shoulders, but I like to mention to the buyers that they're going to need an insurance binder for the mortgage company on the new property. Again, the mortgage company 90% of the time is going to handle that. Every once in a while that falls through the cracks at the last minute and your client's left sort of fumbling for a last minute policy. But they're easy to get because they can get a binder online fairly easily, talking to an agent, giving them all the specs and arranging a payment. But they will need an insurance binder typically to bring to that closing table, or the attorney will need it ahead of time to get that closing done. Reminding on the buy side that your clients need to bring their identity, their proof of identity, and the bank check for whatever the closing attorney has told them that they need, right? That needs to be a bank check. If there's any individual, so let me talk about a couple of other things that might be sort of last minute. We talked about Title V, we talked about 6D. We got smoke certificates to consider in this process, right? From the fire department. With COVID, it's a little different, not completely different, but there are many communities that are still doing smoke. So as a listing agent, you need to reach out to that community or that city or town and see, are they in fact doing smoke inspections? I know Boston is, Needham is, Newton is, there's a lot of communities that are still doing them. The closing I have out in Westford, they're not doing them. So then that gets arranged through the attorneys how that's going to get handled. And Massachusetts has handled that with the COVID addendum, and the attorneys are handling that in their language in the purchase and sale. So they can close without a smoke cert in Massachusetts right now if those are not available in the community. From the listing agent side, a couple of other things to consider. Final water reading. If there's water and sewer in the property, with the municipality, you need to put in an order for a final reading. So you can do that on the front side. Usually once the purchase and sale is done, I do that. Some of them have online places where you can go enter that information. You'll need the buyer's, the seller's information. You'll need the attorney's information because they'll get that final reading right to the attorney. But you want to have all that lined up so there's no surprises. One other thing to consider is if it's an oil tank. If it's an oil tank, You want to make sure that the sellers get a credit for the oil that's in the tank. So as a buyer's agent and a selling agent, you'll look at the final reading. When you do the walkthrough, probably you'll look at the tank to see what level is there. And on the sell side, you'll typically get the last invoice that the clients paid for oil to use the rate, and they'll get a credit by gallons. Like if it's a, if it's a 200-gallon tank and there's a half tank, it's 100 gallons. So they'll get a credit of 100 gallons times whatever the last rate per gallon they paid. And that typically will, again, also go on the closing disclosure. Or sometimes they'll have the buyers write a check at the closing table for the sellers for that amount. Okay? So you need to know water, sewer, Title V, smoke, oil tank reading, propane tanks. Chip's mentioning a propane reading, but I'm not under the impression you can read a propane tank, actually. I didn't know there's a gauge on there. So you might have to check it. There is, yeah. So you can tell propane reading potentially or credit. And again, sometimes these fall through the cracks on the listing side. You want to be careful. That could be like an oil tank reading for someone. If they have almost full tank of oil, that can be a decent amount of money for a seller. So you don't want to lose track of that as a selling agent for your client, because there's not going to typically be any going back on that. They're going to want, and the attorneys aren't typically going to watch that kind of stuff. They leave that more to you guys because you know what is and isn't in the house. And then you might want to remind both on the buy and the sell side, again, we don't have to have any responsibility for this, but on the buy and the sell side, you might want to remind folks to just handle the general utilities, calling the electric company, calling the gas company, calling the cable company, making sure they're shutting off service and making arrangements. Like for electric, most electric companies will do the turn-off order. Once the new person calls in the account, they won't technically flick the lights off. They'll just rotate the account right over to the new owner. So, but you want to make sure that both sides have put their information in and make sure that that's handled prior to the closing, because they'll ask for the dates at that point. Okay. Then we're going to write, as we get up to that closing, we're going to do a final walkthrough. You want the buyer to do you want to go with the buyer, do a final walkthrough right before the closing, as close to the closing as you can get, to ensure that the property is in the same state that when you agreed to buy it. If the sellers have moved out, have they left it in good condition, or did they gouge up walls on the way out the door? Did they really clean it as we asked them to? Did they really remove stuff as we asked them to? Has there not been any damage? You want to make sure there was no frozen pipes or fire damage or any of that kind of stuff. So, doing a quick utility check, like I usually check the stove and the dishwasher real quick and run the water a little bit, make sure everything looks like it's okay, and then just do a quick walk around the house to make sure, again, it all looks like it's in the same state and it's in the condition we've agreed to. Like stuff has been removed that needs to be removed, stuff that we meant to, we wrote the washer and dryer and the refrigerator in, they need to be in the house. We need to make sure those were left behind. So again, because if there's any problem coming out of that, you're going to get the attorney in the loop to figure out how that's going to be remedied before everybody signs papers. And sometimes if there's an issue at the walkthrough, the money can just be escrowed to handle the problem after the fact, but they can still go forward with the closing. Okay, but you want to be comfortable that your buyers are signing on the house that they expected to be signing on in the condition that they expected. You don't want any surprises after the fact. Many times with walkthroughs, we've gone and there's been furniture and trash left behind that shouldn't be there, which could be hundreds of dollars for that buyer to get rid of if we didn't bring that to the attention, or damage to a property that wasn't there when we originally purchased the property. There's all kinds of possible scenarios. So you really do want to go. We did have one instance where the folks had moved out 2 weeks before the closing and a pipe had burst. So there was huge damage in the house. So again, don't ever say, well, it's fine, somebody was there a week ago, especially anything can happen. I had one house where a squirrel got in. And so there was all kinds of damage from a squirrel. So you don't ever say you don't know. Walkthrough should be as close to the closing as possible. Sometimes the night before if it's a closing first thing in the morning, but ideally really on that day of closing is the best alternative or the best plan. If my clients haven't been able to make that close, I'll typically go as the buyer's agent and tell the agent that my buyers can't come, but I'm going to go do a quick walkthrough for them prior to the closing. So that's an option. If for some reason the buyers can't logistically do that, as an agent, take that responsibility and go do the walkthrough and either FaceTime them in or just to make sure you feel safe that, there's not going to be anything hitting you back on a liability standpoint. Okay. Listing agent, your big piece is making sure the sign removal request goes in. We haven't sort of talked about what you can be doing with the sign through this process, but typically making sure you put that sale pending rider up to drive more traffic to yourself as a listing agent. Once it goes, once you've got that mortgage commitment, that's when you throw the sold sign on. So you throw the sold sign on for a while and then make sure that sign is removed, as close to the closing date as possible so that it's not inconvenient for the new buyers. Going to the closing as an agents, again, that's not an option in today's market because they're not allowing agents because they're closing in the car. And a lot of times now the attorneys are doing power of attorney, so the people aren't actually going to the closing. If your folks in a regular market are going to the closing table, you really should be there with them if you can. So, and again, you're not going to typically do anything, but it's support. It's that extra set of eyes just to make sure everything looks okay, that if there's any questions, you do, if you're on the buy side, you want to make arrangements for keys and garage door openers for your folks. Were they at the house when you did the walkthrough? If not, then you reach out to the listing agent. Hey, how are we getting the keys? How are we getting the garage door openers? How are we getting all the components, any warranty things that need to be switched over, so that we can make sure that the buyer has everything they potentially need at that point. Go to the closing or don't go to the closing as an agent. On either side, you're going to need a copy of the final closing, what they call the CD, or the closing disclosure. It used to be called the HUD, now it's called the CD. That's the closing disclosure. You need to get that, load that up into your loop so that you can close out the transaction with the admin and they know that it's closed. They'll ask you to let them know once it's on record, and or they'll verify that it's on record before we actually close it out as a company. Okay. And if there's money that needs to change hands for whatever reason, like if you're on the buy side, typically we're waiting for a commission check. So you want to talk to that listing agent about how are you getting your commission check. Again, your responsibility to make sure we get the CD and the check so we can close it out and pay you. Right. So you need to stay on top of that. Options for them giving us a commission check. You can pick it up and throw it in one of the offices. It can be mailed directly from them to our corporate at Huron Drive, which is not a bad option, but then, let the admin know that here's the CD and the commission check's being mailed directly to this address. So they know to follow up and keep it in their loop and sort of make sure that everything closes out. Okay. And then in this company, you're paid within 3 business days of once that's closed out. Typically that's a lot faster. So I would recommend, if you haven't had it set up, get your automatic or direct deposit set up, because then you typically get paid even quicker, because we don't have to find you for the checks, right? Especially with the COVID piece. So if you're not seeing a payment for whatever reason and you thought it's closed out, then reach out to your manager or the admin and follow up to make sure that maybe the check didn't arrive or maybe something's missing in that. The admins, again, are very good typically on staying on top of that and following up with you and saying, hey, we know this closed and we haven't gotten the CD, but they shouldn't have to chase you for that stuff. You guys should be making sure that gets in so that they can actually close that out and get you paid. Post-closing sort of follow-up, the things I would recommend. So make sure that so from a past business standpoint, I always took and put, my buyer was already in my database if I was on the buy side, but I always added my sellers to the database, or the other side of the deal, to my own database and started to communicate with them. So you're going to want forwarding addresses for anyone that is moving so that you can update your database. Also, like if you're on the buy side, it's helpful to get the seller's forwarding information and or potentially a cell phone, although not everybody's willing to always share that because they might have questions on the buy side. There might be stuff about warranties. There might be questions about turning the sprinklers on or things that they haven't really thought about that will come up over the next month or so, and they just want to be able to reach out. A lot of sellers are good and they'll make lists of that stuff, but if they haven't or a question comes up, you want to have that communication available. I know we've got a deal right now in Chelmsford where, just trying to get an answer of who serviced something and you can't get anybody to respond. And so the buyers are stuck trying to figure it out. Okay, so the more information, the better that you can get. Load them both into your database. I'm a strong believer in closing gifts for your party in the transaction as a way to show your appreciation. That what you do is up to you. But then I would put in your calendar a couple of follow-ups with that person post-transaction. So if you're on the buy side, right, I typically will say to the buyers things like, so when are you actually moving in? You know, and I will do the closing gift. I'll actually deliver the closing gift to the house once I know they've moved into the house. So that's one other check-in point that I can have with them and see how things are going and make sure they're okay with everything. And then usually within, I usually put it on the calendar for a month and then 3 months and then 6 months to follow up to ask them how things are going, how they love their new house, you know, if they were making additions. A lot of people love to have you come over so you can see the changes they've made to it, how they've made it their own. Nothing funner than showing up at a, client says, oh my God, you got to come over and see. We you know how we talked about painting the kitchen and doing this, and you got to come over and see it. And so you show up with a nice plant or something and see how they do. They love that. And that is where you turn yourself into their agent for life, right? And it's also where you generate your referrals. So the other piece we haven't talked about here on the buy and the sell side is getting testimonials. Right? So making sure you get client testimonials, whether they send you an email, whether they post it on, Yelp or Zillow, whatever you want to use. I would recommend using one source and driving all your clients there so that you can get leverage from that and build up an online rating, wherever you decide to do that from. Okay,
It's
right now.
It's interesting that you said that. One of the vendors that I've connected with and been working with, she does complimentary catered client housewarming parties.
Yep.
Kind of to that effect, exactly.
So that's actually a beautiful option, and I've done that in the past. You tell the buyers that you would love to host their housewarming party for them and invite some of the neighbors, and you do like a little wine and cheese party, and guess what? You have a client that loves you, that moved into the neighborhood, and you now get to be at a party with all the neighbors as the agent that brought these people in, right? The other piece of the follow-up is you should always be marketing to that surrounding area. You should use that as leverage on the just sold side. My buyers are now in the house. I mean, you want to be the agent that did the sale. Yep, Real Satisfied is another method that Commonwealth's currently using. Chip, I don't know that we're going to stay with that long term, but again, that's a automatic that goes out to the buyers and the seller side now from Commonwealth so that you get those endorsements and you can go forward from there. I recommend as well utilizing something online that makes sense for you. And again, pick one so that everything's in one spot so you start to build some traction and you can add them into your book. And then make sure you ask for referrals. Who else? I really hope that I delivered 150% service for you. Who else do you know that you would like me to work with that I can help buy a home so that they get that same level of service? They don't get stuck out there just floundering in today's market. On the sell side, making sure you follow up. First of all, I always put the buyers in my database. They've now bought a house that I've sold. I can't tell you over the 20 years in my business how many times I've actually turned around and sold the same house again because I've kept in touch with the buyers. They saw me act as the selling agent, and when they're ready to sell, they call me because they're like, oh, she's the selling agent. My agent was a buying agent. She's a selling agent. I've done at least 10 homes that way because I put them in my database. I kept in touch with them, followed up, asked them if they needed anything, just sent them marketing, and they've called me as opposed to their own agent to come in and do an evaluation when they've wanted to move. So they should go in your database. Not bad idea to follow up or pop in on them, make sure everything's good. On the sell side with those clients, again, having a forwarding address so you update your database. If they're still in territory, keeping them in the loop and following up with them and not forgetting not to ask for recommendations, right? Who else do you know? A lot of times, like in my case, my friend's moving and it's, my generation's all moving out of Westford now. That's a huge pile of people that they know that are all getting ready to depart, right? That's a big asset in terms of being able to turn and be the person that everybody goes to. And that they know made the transaction easy. Think of ways too through the transaction that you can take the stress off those folks, whether it's on the buy or the sell side. So I'll give you one example. In the case of the sellers that are closing this week, they've just happened to have some family health problems with a mother, and the mother passed away suddenly. And so I called them the other day and said, look, the move out is Monday. Move out. I knew they had a funeral service today and the closing's tomorrow. So I actually lined up a cleaning lady at my expense. I said, look, just move out, get the stuff together that you need to get together. The cleaning lady's going to hit the house. And it was a big house. They're very appreciative of just that little extra service. For a couple $100, I can take care of that and take the edge off of them. That's money well spent. That's money very well spent from a referral standpoint going forward. So, any other questions in terms of the process? We've kind of taken it all the way through. Make sure you turn those clients into clients for life. And again, by delivering that level of service and really being on top of everything and really being very communicative, the attorneys will love working with you. The clients will love working with you. The other agents will love working with you. It'll make your life a whole lot easier, and it will up your referral capacity or ability. Because again, you'll be the agent that people want to go to. Great. I appreciate you guys joining me. Thanks for popping in. If you haven't registered for